And at this event, Jobs said things like, this is the best way to consume all sorts of media. You can consume educational media, you can browse the web, you can play games, you can watch films, you can do basically whatever you like on this device. So he's talking about the virtues of the device in public. What was really interesting was about a year later, just before he died actually, he was interviewed by Nick Bilton, a tech journalist at the New York Times. And Bilton said to him, "Your kids must love the iPad." And Jobs said, "They've never used one, we don't allow it in the home." Which is a fascinating disjunction between what he was doing publicly and what he was doing privately. Now, he's not the only tech giant who said something like that or did something like that. There's a school in the Bay Area called the Waldorf School of the Peninsula. And Waldorf schools basically have a policy that they won't introduce tech until very late on. So there are no iPhones, no iPads, no PCs, no laptops, which is unusual for a private school, but these schools have that policy. They introduce them around 8th grade, and then they introduce them in what's known as a slow tech approach. So what you do when you first encounter an iPad at the Waldorf school is you learn how to construct it, how to design apps, things like that. You're not consuming media on the iPad just for the sake of consuming media on the iPad. So the interesting thing about this school is that 75% of the students have parents who are tech execs in Silicon Valley. Which again is this strange situation where parents are saying, I work for this company, this is a product that I stand behind publicly, but my kids shouldn't have access to it during the day at school, which is really interesting, I think. So digging a little further, I found a paper that looked at all the studies that had been done on this broad group of issues. So these are all known as behavioral addictions. The use of the word addiction is very controversial, but I chose to use it because I think it aptly describes what's going on here. This paper basically suggested that when you put together all the different behavioral addictions to things like social media, checking emails, work, fitness devices, there are others, shopping. When you put them all together, 41% of the population has had at least one of these in the past year. And that number, this is in 2011, that number is sure to have risen because the adoption of things like iPads has dramatically risen. Virtual reality has become a big deal as well. So I think it's probably close to, if not more than 50% of the population we're talking about. Now, the reason I use the term addiction is because a lot of the hallmarks of substance use are present when people use these devices. Their brains respond the same way, although that's not enough. Our brains, you give a child ice cream, the brain looks the same. I mean, anything delightful leads to the same responses. Also, if our brains responded to just the stimulus itself, every time someone went to a hospital and had pain medication, they'd come out and become addicts. And that's just not what happens. You need that, but you also need this thing, this psychological need that you need to scratch, an itch that needs scratching. It can be loneliness or boredom or anxiety or low self-esteem. It can be lots of different things, many of which are epidemic today. And with that, you add those things together. You have this device or this experience that scratches that itch, and you have behavioral addiction. And one thing you can do is you can ask yourself what goes on during that time. How enriching are the apps that we're using? And some are enriching. If you stop people while they're using them and say, tell us, how do you feel right now? They say they feel pretty good about these apps. Those that focus on relaxation, exercise, weather, reading, education, and health. They spend an average of 9 minutes a day on each of these. These apps make them much less happy. About half the people, when you interrupt them and say, how do you feel, say they don't feel good about using them. Now, what's interesting about these, dating, social networking, gaming, entertainment, news, web browsing, people spend 27 minutes a day on each of these. We're spending 3 times longer on the apps that don't make us happy. That doesn't seem very wise. Now, one of the reasons we spend so much time on these apps that make us unhappy is they rob us of stopping cues. Stopping cues were everywhere in the 20th century. They were baked into everything we did. A stopping cue is basically a signal that it's time to move on, to do something new, to do something different. And think about newspapers. Eventually you get to the end, you fold the newspaper away, you put it aside. The same with magazines, books, you get to the end of a chapter, prompts you to consider whether you want to continue. You watched a show on TV, eventually the show would end and then you'd have a week until the next one came. So there were stopping cues everywhere. But the way we consume media today is such that there are no stopping cues. The newsfeed just rolls on and everything's bottomless. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, email, text messaging, the news, And when you do check all sorts of other sources, you can just keep going on and on and on. I'll just say very briefly, I think one of the things that makes this different from any set of experiences before, makes it different from TV, which people freaked out about, pinball machines, which people freaked out about. People freak out about everything that's new. I think one of the big things that makes this different is the portability, is that it's with you always. That if you take 70% of the population and you ping them at any time of the day, including the middle of the night, and say, can you reach your device right now without moving your feet? They will say yes, 70%. So 7 in 10 of us have this appendage that is always there that feeds us exactly what we need in any moment. So our threshold for thinking and boredom, well, our threshold for boredom is incredibly low. That's why people get into elevators. For like one floor, they'll get in and check their phones, because that moment is so unpleasant to them that they need to do something to soothe that boredom. For kids, though, this is especially pressing. So the guidelines of the American Association of Pediatrics suggest that kids between 0 and 2 should have no access to any screen whatsoever. A large part of that is because in those years, what kids are doing is engaging in this repeated trial and error phase of their lives where everything is a question mark. And the only way you know whether that particular thing you did made sense in the social world and otherwise is by trying it. And you can't try things if you're in front of a screen. All those things need to be tried in the real world. Like you take a kid's toy and the kid bops you on the head. That's really good information, and it only comes in a real face-to-face interaction. All those things need to be tried. The learning expressions, like looking someone in the eye and seeing the way they're moving their faces, they're configuring their facial muscles, that takes time to master. We all become pretty good at it, or at least this generation is pretty good at it. But if there's a whole generation of kids who aren't spending time looking at people in the eye face to face, maybe they'll never have that time to hone that skill, and that's, I think, pretty scary. Now, between 2 and 5, screen time is okay, but in limited doses, according to the association. It should be, as they say, slow screen time. So whatever they're doing should happen slowly. I think one of the reasons for that, whatever you're watching should happen slowly, and I think one of the reasons for that is that we reach a sort of equilibrium that is tied to the fastest thing that goes on for us. So for New Yorkers, for example, where I live, everyone's impatient because nothing is as fast as the fastest thing they experience, which is trying to walk down a New York street when you're in a hurry. So New Yorkers who travel, no matter where they go, no matter how much they're determined to just enjoy themselves and relax, obviously find that place a little bit plodding and a little bit slow because their equilibrium is tied to New York, which is like up there in speed. Now you don't want your kids to experience that. So the best thing to do is make sure that you slowly go from slow experiences to faster ones. They'll be okay with slower ones if they've been exposed to them and not to faster ones. But as soon as they see something fast, that means they don't have to exert attention and effort, that stuff's going to become much less interesting to them.